This is the OpenFX virtual town hall. And my name's Gary Oberbrunner. We'll also be hearing from John Paul Smith and anybody else on the OpenFX Technical Steering Committee who would like to talk about any of the work that we've been doing. So today's agenda, we have an hour. So I'll introduce OpenFX. I suspect most of you are fairly familiar. So we'll run quickly through some of the basic slides describing what OFX is, how you use it, a little bit about the history, and then we'll use the rest of the time to talk about what's new in 1.5, which is released as of today. I tagged the release on GitHub yesterday, and I believe we have a press release going out, and there's a notification on the website. So, here we are. Of course, like any software product, we know that there will be changes and updates. So we're hoping that all of you will give the new features a try and let us know how you like them. And we're always looking for contributions. You can file issues on our GitHub. You can submit pull requests. That's always the best thing. All right, so let's jump into it. So what is OpenFX? It's an open standard for creating and using image processing effects. It's a way for a host product, like a video editor or a VFX tool, to work with plugins in an open standard way. So it replaces a bunch of proprietary APIs that used to exist, and some still do, to simplify both host and plugin development, and hopefully make the process of writing plugins for hosts as broadly compatible as possible with minimal effort. Our official name is OpenFX. Historically, we've been known as OFX, so we answer to both, whatever you like. OpenFX is a 2D VFX plugin API. So it's images in and out. It's not meant for 3D, although there have been some discussions about extending it to 3D modeling. But OpenFX as we know it today is a 2D VFX plugin API. It takes sequences of images in, puts out sequences of images. It also handles the parameter definitions and values, pardon me, and user interaction. It allows plugins to run on the CPU and the GPU. And to be maximally compatible, the API is pure standard C based, although there is a C++ wrapper layer. It's used today by most editing and VFX systems worldwide, with millions of users of those host products and the plugins that go with them. OFX was created in 2004 and has been getting bigger and more popular since then, both in commercial software and in open source. You can see a selection of open source hosts and plugins, as well as all of the commercial tools. And I'll give you a list in just a minute. So why use OpenFX rather than, say, a vendor proprietary API? The answer is, of course, proprietary APIs are a pain for everyone, right? You have to, as a plugin vendor, you have to write a new API for every host. As a host, you have to convince all the plugin vendors in the whole ecosystem to come and use your proprietary API, right? It's a bunch of work, it's maintenance. So back in 2004, a bunch of folks got together, I think probably at IBC or NAB, and decided to, let's make a standard to standardize the plugin interface and open source it. And I think it's been a rousing success. We've saved a ton of dev time and support compared to the proprietary forest of APIs that was present in those days. And there are continually new plugins being developed. There are continually new host products being developed, as well as existing hosts migrating over to the OpenFX API just because of that broad level of support. Okay, so here are some common OFX hosts, definitely names you all know: Flame, Resolve, Scratch, Catalyst, Nuke, blah, blah, blah. And yes, that's a big list, and it's not everyone. One of our goals in the next decade is to get all the rest of the holdouts onto that list. Well-known OFX plugins, also, again, names you will definitely recognize: Sapphire, Revision, Mocha, Digital Anarchy, Frisch Luft, Neat, New Blue, et cetera, et cetera. What you don't see here is that there are a lot of in-house custom OFX plugins that VFX houses develop their own, in-house for their own in-house use with proprietary algorithms. I think there are probably fewer in-house OpenFX hosts, but I do know of one or two. And our hope is that that will grow, as will the whole open source ecosystem. So, as I said, OpenFX is a generic C-based plugin architecture. It's layered. So the very basic layer is just, here's a DLL, here's a couple of entry points. That's all you need for any process running on Windows, Linux, or Mac to talk to a DLL that's compatible, right? That layer is not specific to image processing or visual effects or anything. It's just a generic C-based plugin architecture. And then the image-based API, what we know of as OFX, what we use every day, is built on top of that core. So to make a plugin, all you do is create a shared library with a couple of exported C linkage functions. And then everything else is bootstrapped on top of that. One of the nice things about that is it means that OpenFX is a header-only library. You do not need to link to anything to use OpenFX. Now, we do have a C++ interface. We have a host support library. Those are, of course, available for you. But at the most basic layer, OpenFX as a spec is just a set of header events. What does it let you do? As a plugin, it lets you say who you are, define your parameters, your inputs, and your outputs. It lets host and plugin negotiate what features they're going to use together. The host then creates instances of the effect and tells them to render frames. That's basically it in a nutshell. Now, layered on top of that are user interface interaction, memory handling, threading, progress reporting, message suites, and a bunch more. We probably don't need to get into this level of detail, but basically that code is a valid OpenFX plugin. It doesn't do anything, obviously. But I just want to show you sort of how simple it can be. OFX is based around a number of core concepts. One of the most important is properties. Properties are essentially name-value pairs, like you'll see in a lot of languages. They're stored and looked up by string name. A property, just to be clear, a property is not a parameter. A property is just a name-value pair. I don't know if we have to get into this level of detail today, but just it's an important concept if you're writing a plugin to understand that all the suites, all the actions that you handle as a plugin or that you store as a host are are parameterized by means of these properties. Most of the actual action of the API is in the actions, like load a plugin, unload, describe yourself, create the instance of the plugin, and render. Right? Actions are essentially just the way that the host calls the plugin's execution function with an action name and a set of argument properties. All right. Parameter-wise, OpenFX has a very rich set of parameters: floats, integers, booleans, colors, strings, pop-ups, push buttons. Almost everything that you would expect to be animatable is animatable. And there's also support for spatial coordinates like dimensions and positions that auto resize as the host changes, as the resolution changes. There's also angles and times and scales. It's a pretty rich API. If there are more things that you want as a user, please let us know. One of the nice new features in 1.5 is a new kind of string valued property. So we'll get into that. In terms of actual image processing, OpenFX is frame-based, although a plugin can get alternate frames whenever it wants to, like the frame before, the frame after, or frame 10. It supports generators that take no inputs and produce an output, regular effects that take one or more inputs and produce an output, transitions that take two inputs and produce one output, and then general context, which is just any number of inputs with one output. All effects can run on the GPU and the CPU. One of the nice new features in 1.5 is we've enhanced our GPU support, and we'll get to that. Supports 8-bit, 16-bit, 16-bit float or half float, 32-bit float, RGB, RGBA, alpha, pre-mult, non-pre-mult, so pretty much anything that you want. And I will say at that point that not all hosts support every combination of those images, and not all plugins support every combination. There's a negotiation phase that happens between the host and the plugin, so they can decide which image formats to exchange. And when we talk about the new color support in 1.5, there's a similar negotiation process that happens there. The plugins can get all the clip attributes that they need to process. There's full support for region of interest, region of definition, and now, as of 1.5, there's full support for color space. So a plugin can ask for and understand the color space of the images it's being given, and can define the color space of the outputs that it's generating. But that said, most plugins today assume that if they're getting an 8-bit source, it's Rec 709 or something like it. And if they're getting a float or producing a float, it's scene linear. Our hope is that the new color space support in 1.5 will mean we don't have to make those assumptions anymore. So if you want a log space input, if you're a color plugin, you can request that, and then you'll get your images directly in the host's log format without having to do any translation, and so on. There are interaction suites so that you can draw custom interacts. And this also has an enhancement in 1.5, so we'll get into that. One of the most important things about OpenFX, and one of the reasons it's lasted this long, is it's totally extensible and fully backward compatible. It's suite-based, so we can add more suites, we can rev suites over time, kind of like what you see in the AE API. But what that means is that when we introduce a new suite, the host can continue to support both the old suite and the new suite. If a plugin requests the old suite, it'll get it. If it requests the new suite, the host knows, this is a cool new host. Let's do our new thing. And there's no central overlord who says what the suites are. we, the OpenFX Technical Standards Committee, define the official suites, but any host and any plugin can define their own private or public suites and properties that they want. Nuke has had private suites for years. Vegas has had a stereo suite for years. Blackmagic has the bunch, some of which are now codified in the new 1.5 release. The only thing I would say is if you are one of these people and you're defining your own private or public suites, please preface them with a namespace so that they don't conflict with things that we might do in the standard future. Suites are versioned, blah, blah, blah. Okay. There is also a C++ wrapper around the API. This is built as part of our CI build. You can just download it and use it. Or you can build it yourself as well. It's on our GitHub. It's definitely not required, but some people like it. It can simplify getting a basic plugin up and running. The API is still C-based, but you can use that C++ wrapper to simplify things. This is one of the areas where we would love contributions. The C++ wrapper is getting a little bit old. It hasn't always been updated with the latest stuff. It is definitely not C++ 17 or C++ 20. And we don't have a C++ layer for host apps yet. So we would love anybody who wants to contribute. This would be a huge help. So with that said, that's what OpenFX is. The cool thing that we're here today to talk about is our 1.5 release, which we have been working on, I kid you not, for 10 years. It's a little embarrassing, but there we are. The good news is that since we joined up with the Academy Software Foundation a couple of years ago, we've been making much more rapid progress. We have regular meetings, we've been clearing out bugs, we've been adding new features. We really have momentum now in a way that we perhaps didn't before. So, so don't expect another 10 years before 1.6 is all I'm saying. But with that said, there's a lot of cool new stuff in 1.5. The headline feature, I think, is color management. Plugins and hosts can now negotiate fully color managed exchanges of images, which is something that people have been wanting for, I don't know, a decade at least. And now it's here. And JP is going to talk about that. We also have a new draw suite. And the impetus for that is, of course, the deprecation of OpenGL, right? A lot of people are, a lot of OSs, a lot of hosts are deprecating their OpenGL support, replacing it with whatever they are. So we took it on ourselves to create a device-independent draw suite. It's very simple, just lines and points and circles and colors and images. Nothing fancy, but it's enough to put up interactors on the screen. And then the host is responsible for translating those into native drawing calls, be they DX or Metal or whatever they want, or even OpenGL. The third thing, which is super important, is GPU support. We've had OpenGL buffer support for a long time now, right? Where the host can transfer a buffer containing an image to the plugin directly on the GPU without going through the CPU. And what the new 1.5 release does is extend that to a bunch more popular GPU APIs. And then we've got a couple of minor features as well, maybe not so minor depending on who you are. We have string choice params now, which make pop-up menus more compatible and allow you to add elements in the middle, which you couldn't do before. Again, a long-standing request. We fully support binary data params, which are just blobs of binary data. And the idea there is to allow faster loading and saving, prevent, before you had to base64 any binary data and store it into a string param. We also have provisional support or experimental support for Windows ARM64. We would love to hear from you if you are, especially a host vendor, considering doing ARM64. And we'd love to know whether this works or not. So we'll be happy to work with you on that. Just get in touch. And then lastly, in terms of new hosts, Houdini Side Effects has announced on their blog that they are going to support OpenFX in 20.5 in their new Copernicus image processing node. So super exciting. All right, so color management, draw suite, GPU support. Let's talk a little bit more about each of those. I think we don't really need to talk much more about choice, params, binary data, or Windows, unless, or ARM64. If you do have questions about those, feel free to pop them into the Q&A, or obviously you're always welcome to join our Slack channel. So why don't I turn it over to JP, and he can tell us more about color management, which has been his baby to shepherd through this whole process.
Right, thanks, Gary. So yeah, color management. It should be pretty obvious, but image processing plugins, many of them need to know what the color space of the input images are. Or at least they need to know, am I dealing with a video gamma image or a scene linear image? And OpenFX hasn't had a mechanism to deal with this in its history. So plugins have had to rely on heuristics, like for instance, it's an 8-bit image, so we're going to assume it's Rec 709, or it's a float image, so we'll assume it's scene linear. And sometimes these were right, sometimes these were wrong, or we had to ask the user, or rely on lots of unreliable techniques. There've been a couple of host-specific extensions in this area in the past. Filmlight have had one in Baselight, which works with their color management system. And at BorisFX, we developed a pretty lightweight extension using OpenColor.io. But what we wanted to do was take that OpenColor.io extension and standardize it. And going through that process, really realized that it was a much bigger area, and we needed to go far beyond just the simple OpenColor.io support that we had inside BorisFX. And one thing that actually allowed us to do that was improvements in OpenColor.io, in particular the built-in ACES configs, because that meant we could build an API that was compatible with OCIO and also compatible with non-OCIO hosts. Right, Gary, can you use the next slide, please? So what we've come up with is something that if you're a host or plugin that uses OpenColor.io is really trivial to implement. It's completely based on strings that are defined in the OpenColor.io built-in configs. And even if you're not using OpenColor.io, if you have some existing color pipeline that can support ACES, then these strings can be mapped into the internal representations that you use. And for plugins or hosts that don't really do any kind of sophisticated color management, but only want to know, is this a log image or is it a scene linear image or some other basic parameters, then that can be implemented too. One of the important features is there's a negotiation mechanism, which allows hosts to avoid unnecessary conversions, and likewise plugins to avoid unnecessary conversions. Yeah, fits in with the general approach in OpenFX of a plugin asserting its preferences and the host essentially trying to satisfy them. So yeah, before getting into some more details about that, I want to say big thanks to Doug Walker from OpenColor.io, who provided a lot of input into developing this spec. All right, Gary, go ahead. So one important aspect of this is handling the case of plugins that don't actually do full color management, but need to know these basic parameters. And so to do that, we defined a set of what are called basic color spaces in the spec. And these just cover the most common classes of color space that we come across. And the idea is that any host or plugin using these strings, they're not specifying an exact color space like ACCG or X709. They're saying it is a color space that's in this particular class. And this means that a plugin that expects its inputs to be in a scene linear color space can just assert that, and then it could be any scene linear color space that the host has happened to use that can be passed in directly, avoiding any unnecessary conversions. And if a host or plugin is implemented using OpenColor.io, then it's very easy to add these into the config that's being used as roles, so they can just be mapped to existing color spaces. All right, next slide, please. Right, I'm going to go through an example, and this in the very, very, very pseudo code. Plugins don't really look like this, but this is the kind of negotiation that will happen between a host and a plugin using the color management extension. So first of all, a host calls a plugin and asks it to describe itself. And when it does that, the plugin can see that the host supports a particular style of color management. And the idea here is that there's a set of different styles ranging from OpenColor.io, which is the one here in the example, down to basic. And they all build on each other so that you just mention the highest style that your particular host or plugin supports, and then it will negotiate the lowest common denominator, really. So in this example, we've said that the host uses OpenColor.io, but the plugin only supports basic color management. So the host will then select basic as the way to move forward and negotiate color spaces. So next it calls the plugin. It creates an instance of the plugin, and then it may call the plugin to get its clip preferences. And here the plugin is going to say, well, my preferred input color spaces are scene linear or display SDR. So when the host, so then the next thing is the host calls the plugin to find out what output color space is going to be used. And a host might assume, for instance, that it expects that the plugin is going to produce the same output color space as the input, but that's not always the case. So it's really important to have this step. And in this case, the example plugin is a motion vector generator. So we know that the outputs are actually going to be in a data or raw color space, or not color managed. And so that's what the plugin returns there. It's the output space OFX raw. All right, next slide. So now the host has to decide what color space it's going to provide the input images in. In this case, let's say, for example, that the user was working in a log project and they were using ACCCT. So the plugin asked for scene linear or display SDR, and the host can decide, okay, what's the easiest transformation I could do to take the images into an acceptable color space for that plugin. And in this case, I would say going from ACCCT to ACCG is probably the most straightforward thing to do. And so the host could decide to do that. So now when it calls the plugin's render function, the plugin can query input clip property to find out what color space is actually being passed. And in this case, because we're using the basic color management style, the host will just say it's OFX scene linear. It is ACCG, but this particular plugin doesn't know about specific color spaces like that. So we'll just say it's scene linear. And then when the plugin asks the host to generate an image for a particular input clip at a particular point in time, then the host can call OpenColor.io to process the input image from ACCCT to ACCG and pass it to the plugin. So then the plugin can proceed to render its effect, and when the host gets the output images, they will be in the color space that was negotiated at the beginning, so that OFX raw. Right, next slide, please. So that's the kind of overview of how things work. There are lots of details in the spec for this, in particular handling the native mode. So that is using ACES, independent of OpenColor IO, and the middle ground between the OpenColor IO and the basic version. So particularly keen to get feedback from hosts or plugins that do implement ACES and don't do it using OpenColor IO. Some points for the future development of this. One important part of the spec is that the color space definitions are changing all the time. I mean, ACES version 2 is coming soon. And, we just heard that that's in a sort of preview state in OpenColor IO as of later this year. And presumably it will be a full part of OpenColor IO at some point in the near future. So the color space definitions in the standard are versioned separately from the API itself. And this means that we can easily introduce new sets of color space definitions and have backwards compatibility with older versions that any host or plugin might want to support. And one thing that is particularly interesting is the NanoColor project, which is another project of the OpenColor IO. It certainly looks like it could be possible to implement the OpenFX native mode or ACES mode using NanoColor, and that will be a really interesting future development for this, I think. And I'm also very interested in the color interop forum discussions. So far, this has only really targeted texture color spaces, but hopefully we'll be able to extend that range of cross-project standardized color spaces to start to include some camera color spaces and the broader range of color spaces that a project like OpenFX needs. So maybe a future version of this spec will have a kind of broader agreement across the whole community about what color spaces are being used. So that's it on color management. Back to you, Gary.
Excellent, thank you. Let's see. I guess we should probably say a couple of things about the GPU support as well before we move on to the sort of the where are we and where we're going. As I said before, we've had OpenGL support for quite a few years now. And as of 1.5, we now support OpenCL, CUDA, and Metal. OpenCL, I believe both buffers and images are supported. So if you are a host vendor especially, we encourage you to jump on this extension and pass whatever kind of native image buffers you have, and that'll make everybody run faster. The basic idea is exactly the same as the OpenGL support that everyone's already got. So if you do have Metal buffers or CUDA buffers, it's not a huge deal to add support for that into a host. And similarly on the plugin side, assuming that you've got the right shaders. So I did just want to call that out because that I think it's going to be important. The other ones, these features in 1.5 are the kind that if looking at this slide means something to you, then you'll know that you want them. So I think that is pretty much it for 1.5.
Gary, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to add something on the GPU
please
support, and which is actually a big thank you to Blackmagic and also to Dennis Adams for the contributions to that. So the main part of the GPU extension is something that Blackmagic Resolve had developed internally and had as a private extension, and then they worked with us to actually open source that and make it part of the spec. And then the OpenCL extension on top of that is something that came from Dennis Adams at Sony. So yeah, big thanks to both of them for that contribution.
Yeah, here. And that's the kind of exact collaboration that we're looking to do more of. So yeah, that's where we are today. That's 1.5. We have a long list of things that we would love to do going forward. You're welcome to check out our GitHub. Everything is transparent. We have monthly meetings. You're welcome to come to those. We are currently working with a number of other Academy Software Foundation groups like Open Timeline IO, Open Color IO, the CI working group on various background projects. I'll call out specifically the CI working group because I would love to have a Conan recipe for OpenFX that a new software project could simply add to their Conan file and then immediately get off the ground writing a plugin, without having to deal with Git submodules or vendoring in some version of the OpenFX standard that's going to get stale or whatever. And we are working toward that. So we are also working with some non-ASWF groups like the ASC and SIMPTY. Pierre Jasmine, who's here today, has been working with some folks on the idea of framing decisions and sort of how we could include OpenFX plugins in a broader context. Pierre, if you want to say something quick,
go
just
right ahead. Few things. Yeah, so those projects are sort of parked. They did their specification. Some of it has been now moved to EXR standard attributes, and the USD camera special project, and some of those API in those projects, and it's not just a framing decision list. It's a set of standardizing some camera, some real camera, some camera parameters, and the issue we have with this thing in general is storing data over time, right? A methodology for that. That's all I'm saying. For dynamic parameters. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll call out actually here as well. It may or may not be clear that one of our big open projects that will be probably in 1.6 will be some kind of metadata storage and pass through so that OpenFX can get things like camera metadata, time code, GPS coordinates, whatever happens to come from the camera. It's a big project and it's fraught with interesting questions, but those are questions that we are wrestling with right now. So if you are interested in that kind of thing, or I'll also call out the Open Timeline IO project that where we're trying to help them standardize how effects are stored in an Open Timeline IO context, based essentially on the OpenFX schema. If you're interested in either of those things, I encourage you to come say hi on our Slack channel, come to the meetings, and we would love to have you. Let's see. We get a wonderful staff of volunteers coming to our monthly meetings. This is the core TSC members. And I just want to shout out to everyone here, as well as the folks who regularly come to our meetings but are not yet officially on the TSC. We are always looking for more contributors, and so if you would like to be on this list next year, hit me up. So yeah, how can you contribute? If you are writing a VFX plugin, or if you have a cool image processing algorithm that you think might be interesting to share with the world, or if you're implementing a host application or just an image processing pipeline of some kind that you think could use the ability to have plugins, please let us know and we'll definitely help you get going. It's not that hard to write a simple plugin. I would venture to say it's not that hard to write a simple host, although there are other folks here who can say yes or no to that. We are definitely looking for more members for our technical steering committee. But even if you don't want to come to a monthly meeting, we would love you to open pull requests or help us triage our issues. New GitHub reviewers are always helpful to help us get through our backlog. So if you're interested in that, if you're just a regular open source contribution person and just want to peek in now and then to see how we're doing, hit me up, and I'm always happy to show you around, or any one of our other TSC volunteers. And lastly, as always with any open source project, here's our giant list of links. We hang out on Slack all the time. That's probably the best place to get quick response. We also do have a mailing list. If you want to open an issue, feel free to use GitHub. We are a small project and we are not overwhelmed with issues the way some big projects are. So even if you just are like, I don't get how I'm supposed to do this, feel free to open an issue. We'll figure it out. We're not strict that way. We have our meeting calendar. We do have a Discord. I don't always check that these days, but I think some folks are hanging out on there. And we have our wiki. All of these links, by the way, are on the website and on our GitHub. So that's who we are, that's where we are. And that is OpenFX, including 1.5. So we have some time for a Q&A. I don't think anyone has actually posted anything in the Q&A. So if you want to just raise your hand now, or since we're a small group, just unmute and dive right in. And if there aren't any technical questions, I would love for those of you who are new or just have an interest in OpenFX to introduce yourself and tell us what you're up to. We would love to hear from you. I'm not going to call anybody out by name, but feel free.
Hey, this was great. I'm just a pipeline TD, but was just listening in. So thanks for all the work.
You're very welcome, Bryce. But I'm just curious, what can you say what sort of pipeline it is, Nuke?
I'm at a pretty small studio. We just kind of generally pipeline across all BCCs. So a little bit of everything. Mostly 3D applications though. So I didn't know if this was 3D oriented or not, but sounds like it's more 2D at the moment.
Yes, we are. All right, great. Who else would like to jump in? All right, well, going once, going twice, gone. Any closing remarks from folks on the technical steering committee? All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate your coming out today. And as always, we're here to make your lives better as host and plugin developers. So stay in touch, and we'll see you around.